Thank you. It's always fun to be in this room and talking to friends and colleagues. I'm in the, I don't know, kind of fun position over the last month or so of having been asked to review a number of the background reports that are going to be tabled at the Ag Ministers meeting in Paris later this month. The French, of course, are taking the initiative, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France back late in November last year put together, organized a research team led by GREMA. I have no idea what that acronym actually means in French, but it's a consortium of French research institutes looking at food price instability. Frank Galtier, which is a name many of you will know for the work he's been doing recently, young and quite aggressive in terms of putting on the table policy agendas that even 2 years ago we would have thought were impossibly crazy and just not something we could think about realistically. He's kind of forced us to come back and re-examine what we think is feasible and not feasible, both in the international and in the national arena. I was part of a review process for that GREMA report. French Foreign Ministry was kind of disappointed because what they thought, given my reason, as Schengen suggested, my reasonably well-known proclivities for intervening in market price formation and stabilizing food prices, especially in Asia, we were not able to recommend any concrete actions to the French Foreign Ministry to put on the G20 agenda at the international level. That's the specific task that we were assigned. And partly, I think, we just couldn't figure out how we were going to get the international community organized enough and committed, given the hugely diverse interests, especially between the exporting countries and the importing countries. So my first sort of introduction into this literature, apart from having lived it for the last several decades, was this rather negative report that we had to give to the French, something on the order of 6 months ago. Since then, we have the high-level policy experts on food security and nutrition for the Committee on World Food Security, UN-led group. Their draft report, I've just finished reading it this morning. It's also rather French-oriented in the sense that it's quite willing to recommend actions be taken at the international level to control food markets. A very dirigiste approach to the world. I'm not arguing that that's wrong, I'm just arguing that that's a perspective that doesn't resonate very well here in Washington or in Toronto. And so my guess is we're going to see some pretty sharp conflicts at the Ag Ministers meeting. I hope, Schengen, you take your boxing gloves and protection. I think it's going to be a pretty vigorous debate there. The U.S. perspective is better represented by the draft that the Farm Foundation has commissioned from what I think we all know as the Purdue Group, Phil Abbott and Hurt and Tyner. They did far and away the best early analysis in 2008 on what was driving food prices. And they really did a very careful, analytical, empirical review of what they thought the main factors were. And I think that report has stood the test of time. Found that the Farm Foundation asked them to update that, given that, hey, we're back in the soup again in 2011. This report is a little more provocative, I think, at least the draft that I am looking at. It's a little more provocative in that they take on two, shall we say, vested interests, two clear interest groups, and assign most of the responsibility of the 2011 price run-up to these two factors. One is biofuels. The other is China stocking soybeans. And they think that those two factors account for much of the current panic at the moment in the markets. And part of the evidence they cite for that is we don't have any panic in the rice market. Neither of those factors actually have anything to do with the world rice market, but biofuels clearly affect maize and vegetable oils, and then the Chinese desire to build up their stocks, even in the context of high world prices, has spooked the oilseeds market, soybean market, and the vegetable oil market that goes with that. As I say, that's a little more provocative than they were in the 2008 because they were kind of balanced and then stood back without drawing conclusions. They're pretty sharp about what the reasons are in the current context. And finally, these are all things I'm reviewing, so that's why I'm trying to lay out where I think the debate is at the moment. IFPRI has just is in the process of putting out a policy brief on whether there was a world food crisis at all. Many of you will know Derek Heddy and Schengen certainly does because they're co-authors, will know Derek for rather provocative positions backed by evidence and data, and his conclusion is, well, there's two ways of asking whether there's a food security crisis. One is to simulate the effect of prices using big complicated models and ceteris paribus assumptions, and then ask, well, what would the impact be if all of these other things were held constant, which of course they aren't. So the other way of going at it is to ask people whether or not they feel more or less food insecure, which is actually what the Gallup polling folks did in 2005-06 and then again in 2007-08. Apparently there's even been, the preliminary results are coming in for 10-11. And then the answer is really very, very different. I'm sure this brief is going to be out shortly, but what it says is, well, au contraire. There's 300 million fewer people food insecure in 2008 than there were in 2006. And the reason, of course, is rapid economic growth in India and China. Asia did not allow the food price crisis to pass through into their own economies, contrary to what the IPC might have asked, but Asia actually, country by country, takes its own, those countries take their own food security very, very seriously, and as huge countries in the world food economy, I think, to be quite honest, we all ought to be pretty happy that they do take that responsibility seriously. Because if they want to dump all of that instability out in the world market and all of the adjustment that would have to be done, then I suspect we'd be struggling a bit. So anyway, I think we're actually analytically, empirically, knowledge-based wise, I think we're moving forward pretty rapidly. The 07-08 crisis really caught us by surprise. And we struggled a lot. I mean, Rob, as the sort of the background force on the World Development Report 08 that was published in 07, I mean, I worked on that. None of us in late 06 and early 07 saw the world food crisis coming. I think it was really timely that the World Bank got the report out when it did and made the case for agriculture, for poverty reduction, and for economic growth, but none of us saw the world food crisis coming. And so that's just how recent the new professional analytical attention to food crises, to price instability, to how we cope, how we manage, what we might be able to do. It's really quite new. It's quite new except for some subterranean literature that's been out there for a couple of decades, which I wrote. So it feels actually good. I mean, it's terrible to say that, but to have this problem back on the scholarly academic research policy agenda when it should have been there all along is really quite good. Four things I think we need to do. First, and if we don't do anything else, we have to do this. We need to increase the growth rate of food crop productivity. We simply have to get that back at 2 to 2.2, 2.3% a year from the 0.9 to 1.1, 1.2% it's running at the moment. We underinvested for 3 decades in agricultural research and development. One of the reports I'm looking at says, well, we stopped investing in agriculture because the projects weren't any good. Well, that's just nonsense. We stopped investing in research and development when the rate of return is 40% on those investments. We just stopped investing because the prices were low. We can't continue to do that. We have to find a way to have sustainable, long-term, reliable funding for agricultural research and productivity increases. Secondly, I think if we've got another item on the agenda that we can deal with, I think we need to increase food grain reserves, especially for rice in Asia. The ASEAN initiative that Shengen mentioned is clearly a political step in the right direction. I mean, they've been talking about this since 1978. So there's a concern that they're just going to continue to talk about it, but they're trying to make these concrete reserves rather than reserves in principle. They aren't yet talking about trigger mechanisms that would have any impact on prices, but just having physical reserves would be useful. I think we need to go a step further. And here I think I probably even agree with Charlotte. Food reserves, especially if you try to build them when prices are high, are terribly expensive and probably not very effective. What I want an increase in food in rice reserves and corn and wheat if we can do it, but I don't know anything about those markets. If we can get larger levels of rice reserves, then countries are going to be a whole lot more confident that they can use trade. Reserves do not provide a regular flow for consumption. All they do is buffer you against shocks. Trade is the efficient source of smoothing out production and consumption. But you can't use trade if you don't trust it. And the whole point, I think, of building up reserves is so that countries will then trust trade, open up the borders, and use that as the cost-minimizing way of achieving food security. Once you get the stability that comes with the food reserves, you're going to have finance ministers that are going to come in and say, gosh, guys, those big stocks are really expensive. Happened in China, happened in India in the late 1990s, early 2000s. There's no point in holding these huge reserves. Let's bring them back down. Now, we probably brought them down too far in 2003, 4, 5 in India and China. Maybe we don't want to bring them down quite that far. But the whole point is let's get to an equilibrium where you've got enough reserves that people feel we can keep prices reasonably stable, but we're doing most of the food security work. The heavy lifting is through trade. Third thing, and Charlotte just told me this is impossible, so I am still going to put it on the agenda because what we thought was a good idea 5 years ago and kind of not so good right now, it's probably going to, 5 years from now, it's going to seem like a truly dreadful idea, and that's biofuels. I just don't think we can be using grains and vegetable fuels to make liquid fuel. I just don't think we can use grains and vegetable oils to make liquid fuels. And ending the mandates at $120 oil, you're still probably going to have a private incentive. I think the public sector needs to step in and put a wedge in there and tax it. Keep it from happening. We need to find a way to give poor people in the world access to reasonably priced food, and biofuels is going to price them right out of the market. $1 of my gasoline bill is not the equal of somebody in Chad trying to buy maize. I mean, I'm sorry. We need to figure out a way to bring that equity back into the market. Fourth, then, and just carrying on from that, I actually have Francis Moore Lapay's cookbook. Does anybody know what that means? It's called Diet for a Small Planet. It's changing eating patterns in rich countries so that we're far less energy intensive. That is to say, far less meat intensive. I happen to think that's good for our health. I mean, I do it because I think it'll make me live longer. It's even cheaper. I mean, there's lots of reasons why you might think that changing diets to be less resource intensive in rich countries is a desirable thing. The high-level panel of experts devotes quite a big section to how we would change future demand growth. They focus on biofuels, they focus on diets. I think we have to give serious attention to that, partly for equity reasons, partly for health reasons, partly just purely economic reasons. It's just going to make good sense. So 3 quick issues. If we were to pursue that agenda, is local food the answer or is global food the answer? And the answer is yes. I mean, I live in the Sonoma Valley, which is the epicenter of the local food movement. I love it, but that doesn't feed the world. I mean, somehow or other, we need to get a balance between what we can provision locally and what we are going to need globally. Part of the local global is, well, how much is humanity influencing the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle of the planet? 2 weeks ago was at The Economist, the Anthropocene. Humans are changing the functioning of the Earth and Earth systems. If we don't figure out a way to slow that down and maybe get it stabilized, we're probably in deep trouble. And maybe not the next decade, and maybe not even the next century, but 100 years from now, it'd be interesting to be an anthropologist and look at the remains of the civilization. Second big issue is, do we continue to try to do things at the global level, or are we simply going to have to do what economists would call second best and just back up into national actions and let nations do what's best for nations and the spillovers fall where they fall? We all would understand if there's any way to get the governance of global actions on behalf of some kind of communal commons, global communal commons, that'd be great. I see 0 progress, and actually, if I had to do an assessment, I think it was negative. And so I spend most of my time trying to help large countries get their act together. You can help 1.3 billion Indians or 1.2 billion Chinese. I mean, you can really have an impact with a half a dozen countries if you can get them not only to do the food security things they need to do for their own purposes, but help them figure out how to have less impact out on the global marketplace rather than just saying, well, we don't care. So, some kind of a forum where, yes, we really do encourage you to stabilize your domestic food economies, to increase your degree of self-reliance, use the world market in reliable ways. I think that's a pretty productive way to try to be pushing the agenda. Last, and we talked around at lunch whether this was going to come up or not, financial speculation. Is that a real problem for food price volatility? My take, and I'm no financier, I'm barely even a macro person, my take is that the financialization of food commodity markets has significantly increased volatility, but that doesn't happen unless there's some underlying real supply and demand dynamics that get things moving. On the other hand, I happen to believe that volatility, financial volatility, food price volatility, is a terrible impediment to pro-poor economic growth. It's very difficult to get governments, to get policymakers to focus on the long-run investments and policies that they need when they're fighting fires in the short run on instability. I think instability has huge macro consequences, not just for poor households when you get food spikes. So I would like us to make more progress on the volatility. If we can only do it at the country level, I'll do it at the country level, but it'd be fun to hear your ideas on whether we can do it more globally. Thank you.